It's time once again for another edition of Talk to Me. And now, here's Emmy himself, 8-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, Maynard Eaton.
Hello again, my friends. It's another week of Talk to Me, a weekly conversation with political influencers, cultural influencers, civil rights, human rights folks. Today, though, we have a nationally renowned sports journalist. His name is Terence Moore. For more than 40 years, he's been a nationally renowned sports columnist in Atlanta, San Francisco, Cincinnati, now being featured in Forbes.com, MSNBC, and man, how many jobs do you have?
You know what, man? Anybody that pays me, I'm likely to work for them, provided that they're ethically sound when it comes to journalism.
Being a Christian, listen, you covered more than 20 Super Bowls, a number of World Series, Olympic Games, Final Fours, Indianapolis 500, NBA playoffs are now and ongoing. Is this your favorite time of year? You got basketball, baseball, football on the horizon.
Well, first of all, actually, I've covered more than 30 Super Bowls, and wow. There's not a black person who's ever covered more Super Bowls than me. As a matter of fact, that's kind of a thing with me. I'm kind of like a Jackie Robinson of sports writers in so many ways. But with answer your question, you know, I was perfectly built for what I do. Primarily, and this is a thing the other day, 43 years I've been a professional sports journalist. And the bulk of that time, I've been allowed to give my opinion as a commentator or as a columnist. And that has allowed me to write about everything. So it depends on the season. You know, like right now, I love the NBA playoffs going on. In the fall, I love the fact that you got college football and the NFL. And I love the sort of baseball. So it's across the board.
You mentioned being a Jackie Robinson of sports columnists. I was going to mention this later on, but you've been awarded by the National Association of Black Journalists as being the longest running black sports columnist in the nation ever.
In the history of major newspapers, yeah. And that was, 30 consecutive, 33 straight years. And the way that newspapers are constructed now, and the way they're dying, right, and shrinking staffs, I doubt very seriously anybody's ever going to break that record. And essentially, so people can understand this, when you're a sports columnist, that means you're allowed to give your opinion. Right. And so I was only the third black sports writer ever allowed to give his opinion for a major metropolitan newspaper when I worked for the San Francisco Examiner. That was back in 1983. And prior to that, you had a guy named Tom Greer, Philadelphia Daily News, 1978. He lasted for about 6 or 7 months as a general sports columnist. Then the second one was Ralph Wiley. I'm not sure if you heard of Ralph or not, but the late Ralph Wiley.
I'm older than you. I'm older than you, bro. I've heard him all.
Yeah, right. And Ralph worked at the Oakland Tribune for about a couple of years before he left for Sports Illustrated. But when I became the sports columnist, or at least one of them at the San Francisco Examiner in 83, I lasted from that point all the way through the time I left the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2009. So it's going to be a long-standing record.
Terence, tell folks, I may know, but tell folks the difference. You are a journalist, a writer, a reporter, yes, broadcast and print, but a columnist is a little different, is it not?
Well, it's a lot different. I mean, you have beat writers, and beat writers are people who are assigned to a specific team. Right. You might have a lot of people who might be, say, an NFL beat writer. And by the way, to continue this theme about Jackie Robinson, at the San Francisco Examiner, when I went there in 1980, I was assigned to the Oakland Raiders, and I was the first black person ever to cover a National Football League team on a regular basis for a major metropolitan newspaper. And again, that's when you're assigned to a specific beat. Some people are assigned to a specific sport to write general things about them, about it. Like say, maybe the NBA or college football, what have you. But when you're a columnist, you're allowed to give your opinion about whatever. And this is very important. One of the reasons that we've had very few black sports columnists through the years, and I was only the third one, you can see the racism that's involved in the media because they didn't want us, black people, giving our opinion. Okay. We were allowed to play sports. Some of us, very few, and that's another thing, misconception. There are not that many black sports writers, contrary to popular belief. Very few of us were even allowed to write about sports, and very, very, very few have been allowed through the years to give their opinion about sports. And I know a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, what about this guy? What about that guy?" But if you look at the ESPNs of the world, I would say probably about 90% of the so-called commentators, when it comes to sports on national television or what have you, are former athletes or former coaches. When it comes to black folks, when it comes to white folks, it's different. You can be a good journalist per se, and be a white person and be hired all day long to write about sports or give your opinion about sports. But there are very few black people who weren't professional athletes or what have you, a professional coach who has been allowed to give their opinion or write about their opinion.
Terence, on that note, in 1972, after graduating from the University of Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, my first job was covering Don Shula at the Miami Dolphins.
Oh, wow.
I asked him a journalism question. He looked at me and said, "Who the hell are you?" And he got me out of there. It wasn't a rah-rah, hey, coach kind of question. He didn't like it. I never covered the Dolphins again because I was the only black guy in the room. How did you get there? What distinguished you in your career to get to that status, that pioneering status? I know it wasn't easy, bro. I've been here. I've been in the field too.
Well, and part of it is the family that I came from. And I came from a family of Jackie Robinsons. My dad, for instance, my dad started out as a janitor at AT&T in South Bend back in the early 50s, and he ended up being the first black supervisor for AT&T in the history of the Midwest, one of only two ever, one of the first two black supervisors in the history of AT&T. He and his best friend helped integrate the golf courses in South Bend, Indiana, back in the late 1950s. And then even going further back than that, my dad was a paratrooper in the Army, Korean War, and he was like one of the few black paratroopers back then during that time period. My mom in South Bend, there was a place called Associates of Savings and Loans Company. She was like the first black person ever to work for that. My brother Daryl was the first black baseball player in the history of the University of Wisconsin. So this goes on and on and on. So then they get to me. I was the first. I went to school at Miami of Ohio, Miami University, which is the oldest college west of the Alleghenies. It has the oldest college newspaper ever in the United States. I was the first black writer in the history of that paper, first black editor in the history of the Miami student newspaper. Went to the Cincinnati Enquirer as an intern. I was the first black intern they ever had. Paper been around since 1840. I was the first black sports writer the Cincinnati Enquirer ever had. Only the second black writer, period. Then I went to the San Francisco Examiner, became the first black sports writer in the history of San Francisco Examiner. Damn. So it was one of those type of things where, from being a spiritual person, I always believe everything is meant to be. And if you believe in God and if you understand the concepts of how spirituality works, one of my favorite scriptures is Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. Then you know that you're meant to be in certain situations. So I was just meant to be that guy when it comes to a black person in journalism.
But Terence, you had to rise to those occasions. They didn't give it to you. Was it timing or talent or both?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I'll add something else to that. You've got to have talent. You got to be able to know what you're doing. And particularly when you did what I did during the times I was doing it. Yeah. Remember now, we're talking about in the 70s. Dr. King was assassinated in 68. So we're talking about less than a decade or so after his assassination. And things weren't exactly hunky-dory in this country, race relation-wise.
Well, I know.
You're right. So you got to have that. You got to have the talent. Okay. You also have to have the timing. But the other thing that you have to have the endurance. You got to be able, because and listen, I could be on this show for 5 straight days nonstop and tell you about all the horror stories that I had to encounter as a black person being the first in those situations. Okay. But instead of sitting there and whining about it or going through, because it was pretty tough, you learn, and I certainly learned from what my parents went through, is that you can suck it up and you figure out a way to get around it. But it starts with being good. And then it also starts, you talk about the timing, once you realize that you have that opportunity, take advantage of that opportunity, and then it becomes a matter of being able to endure and not let folks discourage you, and just as long as they don't touch you. And then you're fine. They put your hands on you, then you got a problem.
Right. One of the things I admire about you is that you've endured through racial situations with white folks, but you've also endured verbal combat with black athletes as well. Charles Barkley being one of them. So that's not easy on both sides, I'm sure.
Well, and it's not only just black athletes, it's like black people. One of the things, when I came to Atlanta, and I had never worked in the South, I had never lived in the South. And again, growing up in South Bend, Indiana, my dad, AT&T supervisor, got transferred around the Midwest to Cincinnati, Chicago, and Milwaukee. And then my first job out, I'm working in Cincinnati for 3 years at the Inquirer, and worked at the San Francisco Examiner for 5 years. So when it came to Atlanta to work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 1985, I fully expected the backlash I got from the white community racially, although I will admit to you it was 10 times worse than I thought it could possibly be.
Really?
Oh, it was awful. But the thing that I did not count on was what I was facing from the black community. And this is kind of a weird thing because it was almost like a slave mentality. And the way that I write, and I write a pretty hard-edged column, as you know, and I give my opinion that's straightforward and it's not unethical. It's just I give my opinion, I'll tell you what I think, and without wavering. And that's the way you're supposed to write columns. That's why I grew up writing columns. But that was something that people here weren't used to in the South, and probably still aren't used to it. Okay, and not only white people weren't used to it, but black people weren't used to it. People recognize me in restaurants or grocery stores and to my black people, and they come to me and say, "Man, I can't believe that stuff you're writing in that paper, man. You're gonna get us all shot." And in the beginning, I would think that people were kidding, and then it was like, "You're not kidding." Okay, then it went to the other extreme. Michael Vick, you probably heard of Michael Vick.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So Michael Vick, when he was going through his dogfighting problems, I was a point person for ESPN on Michael Vick. Anytime they wanted something that's happening here in Atlanta, Michael Vick, I was the guy they would contact. And of course, I was writing for Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I wasn't very kind to Michael Vick from the beginning because I knew that he was guilty. I knew everything that I wrote from day one turned out to be true.
True.
Okay.
But you were ahead of the curve. That's why
I was ahead of the curve, right? And Maynard, you know who I never had a problem with?
Michael
Vick. Because you know it was true. But I had a whole lot of problems with people in Atlanta, black folks, even in the church. One time I went to church, with the church I go to, and this woman comes screaming and cursing at me in the middle of the church about what I was writing about Michael Vick. And the minister had to kind of pull her back. And I had other people in the church yelling at me about Michael Vick. I had death threats from black people because of what I was writing and saying about Michael Vick. So I was getting it from both sides. I was getting the racial hate mail from the whites that would make your skin crawl. And these phone messages, I would just sit down and laugh at some of these phone messages sometime and be like 35 in a row, beep, N-word, beep. Why don't you go back, beep, 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 beep. So it was a rather interesting experience.
Now, that astounds me, Terence. Now, I was a black reporter on Channel 11 at the time. I read you every day. Maybe because I'm a journalist, I enjoyed your stuff. I never would have thought you got that kind of backlash. I mean, especially from black people.
It was pretty nonstop. And like I said, it was everywhere. I mean, it was like, and that's that's the part that surprised me. What it told me was I was being objective.
Yes.
Because I'm getting blasted by blacks and whites. Right. I mean, I had white people who swore that I was a racist. That's how I said. I mean, you're the biggest racist. I had black people who swore that I was an uptown. All right. You're always ripping the black guys. How come that sort of thing? So it means I was right down the middle.
Well, you mentioned the church. And one of our good mutual friends, Dr. Joe Beasley, civil rights activist.
He's a legend.
He's a legend. You are too. But he said,
Oh, thank you.
He called you a faithful Christian. He's a good man who's made his home on the sports pages and in the church, because you teach in the church too, don't you?
Well, I've taught Sunday school for like 28 years, and teenagers all that time. That's why I got gray hair. But I love teaching teenagers, and I love kids. And along those lines, from a spiritual standpoint, I always tell my Sunday school kids or what have you, and I also teach at Miami University. I'm a visiting professor at Miami, Ohio, where I went to school teaching journalism. I've been doing that for the last 7 years. But I always tell people that you want to find out what your calling is. And I'll just tell you this real quick, Maynard. I used to think, obviously, that my calling was being a sports journalist. I knew since I was a sophomore in high school, which was 1972, that I wanted to be a sports journalist. And I've been on that track ever since. Worked for my high school newspaper, become an editor of a high school newspaper. Told you about Miami, Ohio, being a sports editor there, and graduated from Miami, Ohio on May 7th, 1978. A week later, started working full-time at the Cincinnati Enquirer. Been doing the same thing ever since. So I thought, well, that's my calling. But it occurred to me about 20 years ago that that's not my calling, that this is what I do. My calling is to help young people. And the Sunday school classes, the teaching the kids at Miami University. And I get such a thrill out of the fact that I've got kids just dealing with the Miami, Ohio thing, black and white, that I've taught 7 or 8 years ago that still keep in contact with me. I got people from our class. Maynard, you didn't tell them about the class that we taught.
I was about to get to that. That's how you introduced me to college teaching. You really did.
There you go. I mean, I still have several students from that class who still keep in contact with me. Those are the type of things that give me joy more so than anything else that I do from a writing standpoint or from a speaking standpoint, what I do and what I can do to help young people.
Do you still get a joy of the games, football, basketball, baseball? You still get a joy out of that after all this time? And do you get a joy out of your relationships with these famous athletes? I might know mayors, LeBron James and Steph Curry. I mean, you know them personally.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer that in two ways. The first part, I mean, I get a joy out of it. And there's not a time that I don't think about this, and I don't tell this to my to my mentees, is that we've got the best job on the face of the earth. I mean, we don't work for a living. You're watching sport. It's not what people think, because it's work. Trust me, it's work. Okay, but again, it's not like work. Okay. The second part is going to be a little bit more complicated, and again, this is something I talked about the other day too. You can't, from a journalist standpoint, you can't get a chance to know guys like you used to. Back when I was starting out in this business, and for the bulk of the first 25, 30 years, you really got a chance to know people because it was open access to the locker rooms. I can remember when I worked in Cincinnati back in the mid-'70s, I covered the Big Red Machine, the greatest team of all time. Johnny Bench, Tony Perez, Joe Morgan. And by the way, the dirty little secret, you look at what's going on in baseball right now, we got the numbers of African-Americans shrinking down to less than 8%. Right. The greatest team of all time, the Big Red Machine, was a black team. The regulars on that team, they only had 2 white starters, Johnny Bench and Pete Rose. How about that? I mean, that was a black team. That was my team, Big Red Machine.
Terry, we all who follow you know Cincinnati was your team. Believe me, you talk about it often.
That's exactly right.
I didn't know it was a black team though. That's new information.
Most people don't, because they don't even think about that. But it just tells you about how far in the negative baseball has come. But back in those days, games used to start at 8 o'clock. Sparky Anderson was the manager of the Reds. I can remember being in his locker in his office like 10 minutes before game time, telling him, "Hey, you need to get up to the dugout because there's I got one more thing to tell you." Now you can't even get in the clubhouse even before the pandemic until, you're only allowed in there for maybe like 30 minutes to an hour, 2 or 3 hours before the game time, and then that's it. Okay, so you don't get a chance to know the players like you used to get a chance to know players. So that's the one thing that's a problem. And what I fear, along with a lot of us during this pandemic, everything's been done this way as far as interviews. Right. Through Zoom. And even though teams had said in the beginning that things are going to go back to normal, that we'll still be allowed into the locker room, even on a limited basis that we've been. I doubt very seriously if we're ever going to go back to the old days where you can go down there, maybe you've done it, and you go down and you see think of a name like a Dale Murphy in the old days, or David Justice, or a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or an Oscar Robertson. You just sit down one-on-one and just have a great conversation with them. Those days seem to be over with for the most part.
That must be nostalgic or missing for you. I mean, because they were related. One of my favorite sports stories, my all-time favorite sports story in Miami. Got an interview with Muhammad Ali. He walks down the hallway in Miami Beach Hotel, sits down, looks at my date, and says, "Come on, let's go." He never uttered a word to me. Never said a word.
Well, I mean, there's all kind of stories about that. I mean, I'll tell you, but the first time I met Pete Rose. Pete Rose is my all-time favorite baseball player as a kid growing up. And the first time I met Pete Rose was my freshman year in Miami, Ohio, which is 37 miles to the north of Cincinnati. And the announcer for the Reds at the time, named Joe Nuxall, was a big Miami, Ohio fan. So he got me a press credential to come to the game, to watch the game and interview him. So then he told me, hey, with that press badge, you can go into the locker room. This is May 14th, 1975, May 15th, 1975. I remember the date because it was Tony Perez's birthday. I was such a Big Red Machine fan. I remember all the birthdays. So I'm down in the clubhouse, and the person I want to meet, of course, is Pete Rose. I don't see him. So I'm just getting ready to leave, and all of a sudden I look back, and Pete Rose, I'm a freshman at Miami, Ohio, never met the guy in my life. He's walking straight toward me. He sticks out his hand and says, "Hey, I'm Pete Rose. What's your name?" I said, "Terry Moore." He says, "Oh," he says, "You work for the Cincinnati Enquirer?" I said, "No." He said, "Oh, you will. And they just turned to walk away. May 15th, 1975. 2 years later, I'm an intern at the Cincinnati Enquirer. I'm in the clubhouse. Pete Rose, almost in the same spot, walks up to me. He says, "Hi, Terry. You work for the Cincinnati Enquirer yet?" I said, "Actually, I'm an intern." He said, "Oh, you'll be here full time." Wow. Sure enough, I'm there full time. And my relationship with Pete Rose has been tremendous ever since then. The gambling thing notwithstanding, but he's a great guy. So stuff like that I always cherish.
But Terence, that's how you pierce through the pioneering era of your life. Folks took to you. There was something about you. I mean, not only your copy, but in your personality too. I mean, you have to be pioneering, but you got to be good at who you are and how you are, right?
Yeah, and I do take great pleasure in that. And one of the things that helped me too, I was usually not only the only black, but I usually was the youngest person. When I covered the Oakland Raiders, not only was I the only black beat writer in the National Football League back in 1980, but I was the youngest. I was 24 years old. First year I covered the Raiders in 1980. They go on and win the Super Bowl. And I tell that because a lot of those relationships I still have to this day. Art Shell, Gene Upshaw the late Gene Upshaw before he passed. Lester Hayes, Al Davis. Al Davis used to call me his good luck charm. The first time. And John Matuzak. John Matuzak, some of your viewers probably heard of John Matuzak. He was a crazy man. He was in the longest yard, and just a wild individual. And so Matuzak was one of these guys who was so crazy. I can remember walking out of the Raiders practice field one day, and he just put out a Magnum and just pointed it out at the top of a stop sign and just shot the head of it off. That's what we're talking about. But I'm telling you that because for some reason he liked me, and part of it was the Milwaukee connection. We both we're from Milwaukee, so he always used to tell me about how much he liked. So lo and behold, years later he writes a book, and in the front of the book he gives acknowledgments. And I see Al Davis, I see John Madden, I see all these other Raiders players. And then he has Terence Moore. I'm the only writer that he mentioned among acknowledgments, and that made me feel very, very special.
That was a wild white boy, I have to say that.
It was very wild. Very, very wild.
Let's get back to what's going on now. I got to ask you, I love these stories. You're a storyteller. That's why you're so successful. NBA playoffs, a little different this year, play-in things, Steph versus LeBron, all down the road, the New York Knicks emerging, and your Atlanta Hawks maybe making a move. Great coach, a new coach, interim coach. Your thoughts about what's occurred during this season and what you're likely to see coming through these NBA playoffs, sir?
Well, you talk about the Atlanta Hawks, and something else that I do. I do something called Atlanta Sports Unlimited.
Yeah.
It's a YouTube channel where I run it, and I have a video myself on that channel. One thing I pointed out the other day that you talk about the Atlanta Hawks. The Atlanta Hawks.
You have about 17 jobs, don't you? About 17
I
jobs.
I do, and I could say some more about that, but I won't say what I was going to say. Right? but yeah, I pointed out the other day that the Atlanta Hawks are the scariest team in the NBA because think about this. They only two other teams in the NBA had more injuries this season than the Atlanta Hawks. For the bulk of the season, from the beginning of the season through February, they were operating without a head coach. They had an assistant coach disguised as a head coach in Lloyd Pierce.
Right.
And plus the fact they were the worst team in the NBA in the fourth quarter, literally, statistically. And I mention that because on March 1st, the world changes for them. They get Nate McMillan as their head coach. He was an assistant coach. They slid him down the bench. He takes over. They start getting healthy. Since March 1st, they've had the best record in the East. Since March 1st, they've been the best team in the NBA in the fourth quarter. All these guys have gotten healthy. They're just playing like crazy. They got shooters galore. They got Trae Young. That's the team that I would not want to worry about. And everybody talks about like a Brooklyn with their big three, or
Right.
with Milwaukee with the Greek freak, and perhaps the resurgence of the Lakers now that you got LeBron's healthy. But I'm telling you something, the Hawks went on. I'm not saying they're going to win it all. I'm just saying that the Hawks are one of those teams that if you're not careful, then they could zap you.
As a columnist, as a sports veteran, savvy, do you go into this playoffs seeking the story, or does the story come to you in terms of how it plays out? I mean,
and you asked another good question. And then there's something, and I'm going to take you to Journalism 101 in my class at Miami Ohio University. And what I always tell my students is that what you do is in every situation, you got to go in with an idea.
Right. An angle, at least.
An angle, because of deadline situations or what have you. Like, for instance, you mentioned when the Lakers, when they're playing Golden State, right? The obvious angle there when they played for that play-in game was Steph versus LeBron. Right. So you might go in with an idea, some of your columnists, the history of that relationship, who's got the better of one or the other, who is more important to their team, Steph or LeBron. To take Steph away from those Golden State Warriors, there's some interesting statistic where the Warriors are the worst scoring team in the NBA in the last 3 years. And we all know what LeBron means to the Lakers, what have you. But then once that game begins, you see how it unfolds.
Yeah.
That takes a whole new life that you got to go with what you see more so than what your thought was. And that doesn't only apply to that situation with the Lakers and Golden State or to the NBA. That applies to any situation involved in journalism, where you're talking about sports or otherwise.
Isn't that the fun of it, though? Isn't that the joy of what we do, especially you on a national level? I mean, it's amazing how you walk in that arena thinking one thing, you go back to that something else, right?
Yeah, but I want to tell you something, man. It does become a little maddening because doctors and journalists historically have had the highest alcoholism rate on the face of the earth. I'm a non-drinker, thank God. Otherwise, I've been meaning to be prone to drink. And the reason I'm saying that is the one thing that the readers and the viewers don't see is this thing called deadline. Yeah, you always got a deadline. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I've been right on deadline and something dramatic happens in the game where you have to change your entire focus. And I'm going to give you the epitome of that. And it was in February of 2017 in Houston, Texas, Super Bowl. And I've covered more than 30 Super Bowls. A lot of wild Super Bowls I've covered, but nothing like this, okay? So here you got the Atlanta Falcons with a 28-3 lead at the end of the third quarter against the Patriots. Yeah. So all of us with a brain, we're like thinking, oh, this is going to be an easy night. So I'm sitting there writing about, the Falcons finally did it. They got over the hump. Blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, well, you know the rest of that story.
You look up.
The other team starts scoring. Tom Brady, because of Tom Brady. So now it's like, oh, my goodness, give me a rewrite. So now you're scrambling. You can't really write that the Patriots are going to win because it's not quite there yet. You can't quite write that the Falcons are hanging on. So it was just nightmarish, and obviously the game ends in overtime on the opening drive with the Patriots. So now you're left there. At least I was left there with like in 10 minutes. I got to rewrite all this stuff again. That's not fun. I'll tell you that. That is not fun. So I did not enjoy that one bit.
We did watching your writing. We did. Finally, you talk about being a Christian. But this past year, or since you've been in it, you've also seen the emergence of activist athletes. What's going on? Some civil rights leaders have told me, well, they're just talking. They're not really in the game. I mean, they're playing the game, but they're just talking. For where you sit, where are athletes like LeBron and others in terms of their social protest activism? How do you analyze that, sir?
I love it. The only thing that I have a problem with right now, I do sense that some of the juice is leaving. And I just want them to keep their foot on the pedal here. And I'll tell you this, Maynard. I'm going to tell you this in a couple of parts. You mentioned like Charles Barkley. Charles Barkley and I, we've had a really interesting relationship. Okay, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But it starts with this. I'm old school in the sense that I'm a big fan of the Jackie Robinsons, the Muhammad Ali's, the Arthur Ashes, the Bill Russells back in the 50s and the 60s. Those athletes who really understood their roles as role models. Jackie Robinson being number one. Jackie Robinson, to me, is one of the most underrated Americans ever, because everybody talks about April 15, 1947, and that obscures the fact that the post playing Jackie Robinson was even more powerful than that. He was a very staunch civil rights activist, marching with Dr. King or what have you.
Republican though. I mean,
with an asterisk.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I got you.
All right.
I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm not saying that was wrong, but that's what he gets knocked for that.
Well, and I don't know how much time we have here, but that's a whole show. That's a whole show because yes or no. If you want me to go into that, I can go into that. Do you want me to go into that? Or say
briefly? Yeah, please. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
You're good.
I don't know if I go into it briefly, but I mean, people forget that in 1956, Dr. King voted for Eisenhower, for instance.
That's true.
His father in 1960, Daddy King, and I know a lot of this stuff. I used to go to Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Atlanta, Georgia. 1960, his father, Daddy King, voted for Richard Nixon. Yeah. Matter of fact, Daddy King was a Republican all the way through. And plus, and as you know, Maynard, the Republican Party pre-1964 Civil Rights Act was a different Republican Party than post-Civil Rights Act 64. Okay. Matter of fact, the majority of blacks were Republicans prior to 64. That was a whole different Republican Party. The other thing about Jackie Robinson, as you can see, I'm a Jackie Robinson historian. Jackie Robinson was a supporter of Richard Nixon over John F. Kennedy simply because he thought, like many people, that John F. Kennedy was sort of like a spur of the moment supporter of civil rights. That he was just saying this to try to get elected, where he thought that Richard Nixon was more sincere. And a lot of the evidence showed that perhaps he was correct about that, okay? But the turning point for Jackie and the Republican Party it was two parts, came in 1960, right before that election, when Dr. King was arrested here in Atlanta, Georgia, and was almost sent to prison. And, being sent to prison in Georgia back then, that was not a good thing for a black man. He'll never be heard from again. And so Jackie Robinson pleaded with the Nixon folks to please do everything you can to get Dr. King out of jail. And the Nixon folks would not do it because they didn't want to be associated with that. Whereas the Kennedy folks said, we're going to do it. And of course, the rest of history helped them with that. So
and Daddy King, as you well know, switched parties. Am I right? Became a different.
That I don't think so. I don't believe that's so. You might know more than I know about that. I don't think Daddy King ever switched parties. But I do know this. Here's the second part I was going to say with Jackie. So Jackie was through with Richard Nixon after that. He was done. Then in '64, you had crazy Barry Goldwater, running, and he wanted nothing to do with that because Jackie was a Nelson Rockefeller Republican. Nelson Rockefeller was sort of that day's John McCain. Okay.
Yeah.
So So he started moving away. And then by the time we get to 1972, the election between Richard Nixon and George McGovern, and actually go back to 68. 68, that between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, little known fact, Jackie had totally left the Republican Party that time, and he supported Hubert Humphrey in the 68 Democratic for the Democratic nomination and for the presidency in 68, and he went for McGovern in 72. So that's probably more than you wanted to know, but like I said, I'm Mr. Jackie Robinson here.
You also missed the politics in many ways. And last question. Last question. Politics. The politics of college athletics. Are college athletes going to get paid now, or is that just up in the air? I mean, it seems like they've been ripped off for to go to the store and see a kid's name on a University of Georgia jersey, and he's not getting a dime for it. To me, it's just slavery.
This is another long subject, but this time I promise I'll give you the short version of this one here. I'm in the minority because I've been consistent on this. I think paying athletes is straight from the devil. And once that gets out of that horse or cow gets out of the barn, whatever that saying goes, people are going to rule the day that this happened. Because there's so many things that people are thinking about. The knee jerk. I'm just going to give you one right here.
Okay.
Once you start paying athletes, you can say goodbye to college athletics the way you see it right now. My Miami of Ohio, say so long. All right. It's going to be the big 7, 8, or 9, or 10, and that's going to be it.
That's true.
And then if you think you got cheating in college athletics right now, you start paying athletes, and we all know that once you start introducing money into anything, it changes the whole dynamics. You know, there are 130 Division I, 1A programs. That's so-called 1A, the big boys of college football. Out of the 130 big boys, Maynard, I ask you this question: how many of them approximately make money in a given year?
Maybe 5 or 6. Notre Dame being one of your top.
Something high five. You're exactly right. Okay. So what's wrong with this picture? And what people see is they see that the NCAA gets $1 billion, which it does from its various television contracts. They say, or the big payoffs that come from the college football players, what have you. But they don't see that when you start bringing it down to these individual schools outside of Georgia, Michigan, Texas, and Alabama, they're not making money. And it's the football programs making money, and these football programs are funding the rest of the athletic departments. So if you're talking about paying athletes, well, okay, who are you going to pay? You got to pay everybody just by the letter of the law because of Title IX. And so that's not going to be a problem for the Georgias of the world, or perhaps the SEC. I just read today they're giving like $35 million, the SEC, to each member school now to help them compensate for what happened during the pandemic. My Mid-American Conference, they can't afford to do that. Okay,
Black colleges can't afford it either.
They can't afford to do that. Okay, right. So the big boys are going to have all the money. Okay, because even though you mandate that everybody's going to have to pay the same amount, Ohio can't do that. Morehouse can't do that. These other colleges can't do that. Okay, so it's just these are all the things that nobody wants to talk about because it just sounds so easy. Well, you need to get paid. Well, okay, I wish I had $1 billion, but I don't. Sorry.
Terence Moore, I want to end this on this note. Watching the Hall of Fame inductees, especially the Kirk Gowdy, I'm saying it correct, award, these journalists. I said that day, you belong there, and you will be there. Really, you're as good as it gets, buddy. Really, I appreciate you. Thank you for taking the time. You're a pioneer and well-deserving of the accolades you receive. Really.
I appreciate the invite here. I'm glad we could connect. Sometimes we have a little trouble connecting, but I'm glad we were able to get it done. Or hey, you know about the South, man. I'm glad that we were able to get her done. Is that what they say? I still don't know what that means, but that's what they say here in the South.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Talk to Me with our guest, the renowned sports journalist, Terence Moore. See you next week. Thank you, man.